There is a rare, quiet kind of intimacy that only exists in the spaces we don't bother to curate. It thrives in the unglamorous, unscripted corners of life, far away from candlelit dinners, practiced compliments, and the pressure of first impressions. For Ben and Sadie, that intimacy had been the unspoken baseline of their existence for exactly 6 years. They had mastered the art of being entirely exposed to one another without ever having to name what they were doing. It was a flawless platonic partnership, a safe harbor built out of late-night grocery runs, weaponized family drama, and inside jokes that routinely destroyed their sleep schedules. To their families, their closeness was a source of constant, exasperated speculation. Parents and siblings dropped heavy, unsubtle hints at Thanksgiving tables, entirely unable to comprehend how a young man and a young woman could spend nearly every spare hour together without a romantic label. But Ben and Sadie always laughed it off, hiding behind the armor of a lifelong friendship, terrified that even a single misplaced word might shatter the safest anchor they had in the world. The foundation of their entire history had been laid on a rainy Tuesday night 6 years ago at a bleak, neon-lit 24-hour diner on the edge of the university campus. Ben had left his booth for exactly 2 minutes to use the restroom, leaving his half-eaten plate of fries on the laminated table. When he returned, he found a girl with a wild cloud of dark hair and an oversized denim jacket sitting entirely unbothered in his seat. She had looked up at him with absolute boldness, slipped one of his golden, salted fries into a puddle of strawberry milkshake, and dryly informed him that if he left his post in a sanctuary of survival like this, his assets were legally forfeited. Ben hadn't been angry. He had been completely spellbound. Instead of asking her to leave, he had slid into the opposite side of the booth, ordered another plate of fries, and spent the next 4 hours talking to a stranger until the sun began to bleach the horizon. From that night on, Sadie became his permanent gravity. Over the years, as they moved out of college and into the heavy, exhausting reality of their 20s, that diner booth expanded into a life shared in parallel. They became each other's default setting. If Sadie had a disastrous day at her corporate design firm, Ben would show up at her door with a bag of cheap corner store candy and a willingness to listen to her vent for hours. If Ben was forced to navigate the minefield of his family's complex holidays, Sadie would sit next to him, intercepting the awkward questions from his aunts with a smooth, protective wit that left him completely breathless. But beneath the comfortable surface of their camaraderie, Ben carried a quiet, aching secret that he had spent years burying in the deepest, most silent chamber of his heart. He was hopelessly, completely in love with her. It was a slow-burning realization that made his ordinary life incredibly difficult to navigate. Over the last 2 years, every single date he went on felt like a grueling piece of manual labor. He would sit across from perfectly nice, attractive women at upscale bars, actively checking his watch, filtering his thoughts, and forcing a conversational rhythm that felt like a job interview. It was exhausting. Yet, spending 6 hours with Sadie, sitting on a ragged couch in complete silence while they both worked on their laptops, felt entirely automated. It felt like breathing. It was the only time his mind was entirely quiet. The fragile boundaries of their perfect lie came to a sudden, catastrophic halt on a freezing midnight in the middle of November. The catalyst wasn't a grand romantic gesture, but rather the absolute, unglamorous absurdity of a broken appliance. The ancient washing machine in Sadie's cramped apartment had suffered a catastrophic internal failure mid-cycle, pumping gallons of soapy, gray water directly onto her linoleum kitchen floor. By the time Ben arrived with a trunk full of old towels and a shop vac, the kitchen was a shallow swamp, and half of Sadie's wardrobe was trapped in a heavy, sodden heap. Desperate to salvage her clothes before mildew set in, they bundled the wet fabrics into giant plastic trash bags and drove through the deserted, mist-shrouded streets to the only place open, a humming, empty 24-hour laundromat on the Lower West Side of the city. The laundromat was a surreal theater of absolute stillness. It was completely deserted, illuminated by rows of harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights that cast a stark, clinical glare over the linoleum floor and the long rows of white industrial machines. The air was thick, heavy with the comforting, nostalgic scent of synthetic lavender, heated metal, and powdered detergent. The rhythmic, low-frequency hum of a dozen commercial dryers created a hypnotic vibration that seemed to isolate the small space from the rest of the sleeping city outside. Ben and Sadie stood on opposite sides of a massive, smooth formica folding table in the center of the room, working their way through a mountain of warm, clean laundry. The initial adrenaline of the apartment flood had faded away, leaving them both wrapped in a heavy, late-night exhaustion that laid their defenses completely bare. They reached for the final, most frustrating item in the basket, a large, faded blue fitted sheet. It was a classic piece of domestic comedy, an impossible geometry of elastic edges and tucked corners that they had tried to fold together a dozen times before. Sadie grabbed two corners, tossing the opposite ends across the table to Ben. They began the familiar, synchronized dance, stepping toward each other to align the seams. But as they met in the middle, their movements slowed by fatigue, their fingers brushed over the rough elastic edge. Ben's hand lingered against hers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The contact was brief, but it felt like a sudden, violent spark of static electricity cutting through the sterile quiet of the room. An immediate, suffocating silence descended upon the folding table. The fitted sheet sagged heavily between them, suspended by their frozen hands. Ben didn't pull away. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked onto her fingers against his skin. Sadie didn't move either, but her breathing suddenly shifted, turning shallow and rapid. She didn't look up at him immediately. She kept her eyes fixed on the blue fabric, the soft, clinical light of the fluorescence highlighting the sudden, tense line of her jaw. The silence stretched, heavy and vibrating with 8 years of unsaid things, before Sadie finally broke it. She took a slow, shuddering breath, lifted her head, and looked directly into his eyes with a loaded, hyper-aware question that she had never found the courage to ask before. "Ben, why are you still single?" Sadie asked, her voice a quiet, fragile melody that carried a strange, uncharacteristic vulnerability over the low rumble of the industrial dryers. She tried to force a small, casual smile to her lips, to frame it as just another light-hearted late-night conversation, but the smile failed her completely. Her eyes were dark, intense, and searching his face for an answer she seemed almost terrified to receive. Ben stared at her, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs with a violent, primitive intensity. He looked at the stark white lights above them, then down at her hands, and realized with an absolute, liberating certainty that he was completely done with the camouflage. He was done with the jokes, done with the safe platonic boundaries, and done with the exhaustion of pretending that the woman standing across from him wasn't his entire world. He let go of his corners of the fitted sheet, allowing the fabric to collapse onto the table between them, and looked directly into her eyes with a raw, unfiltered honesty. "Because every single time I try to like someone, Sadie, I end up comparing them to you," Ben answered, his voice deep, steady, and entirely devoid of any humor. He took a slow, deliberate step closer to the table, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly freezing. "And nobody ever feels as easy as you do. I spend 2 hours on a date with a nice girl, and it feels like a grueling 8-hour shift. Then I spend 6 hours sitting on the floor with you doing absolutely nothing, and it feels like breathing. I'm single because I'm entirely ruined for anyone else, Sadie. Because nobody else in the world is you." The words hit the quiet room like a physical shockwave. Sadie's entire body went completely rigid, her hands dropping the remaining corners of the sheet as it fell into a messy, discarded pile on the table. A deep, burning pink blush erupted at the base of her neck, rapidly racing up her collarbone to color her cheeks and the tips of her ears under the harsh glare of the lights. She stepped back, her lower lip trembling violently as she stared at him in absolute, stunned disbelief. That is not a best friend answer, Ben," Sadie whispered, her voice a ragged, fractured breath that sounded completely stripped of her usual confident wit. She wrapped her arms tightly around her waist, her eyes wide and glistening with a sudden rush of unshed tears. "You can't just say something like that to me at midnight in a laundromat and pretend it's normal. You can't blame this on the late hour. I'm not blaming it on the hour, Sadie, and I'm definitely not giving you a best friend answer, Ben said, his tone carrying a sudden, powerful determination that he had suppressed for years. He didn't stay on his side of the barrier. He walked slowly and deliberately around the edge of the massive Formica folding table, completely invading her personal space, stopping just inches away from her shivering frame. The scent of her, the familiar, comforting blend of her lavender detergent and her vanilla perfume, engulfed his senses, erasing the clinical coldness of the industrial room. You think this is sudden? Ben continued, his eyes boring into hers with a fierce, absolute sincerity that made it impossible for her to look away. You have set an agonizing, impossible standard for my life, Sadie, and you've been doing it for a very long time. Do you remember my 23rd birthday party last fall? My mom had baked that massive, triple-layer chocolate cake, and the structure completely collapsed in the back of my car during the drive over. It was a horrific, ugly disaster of frosting and broken crumbs. Everyone at the party laughed, made their jokes, and eventually left the apartment by midnight. But at 1 o'clock in the morning, you didn't leave. You sat flat on the cold linoleum kitchen floor with me, pulled 2 metal forks out of the drawer, and spent an hour eating the broken pieces of that ruined cake straight off the cardboard box with me in the dark. You looked at me with frosting on your nose and told me that things don't have to be perfect to be sweet. I sat on that floor, looking at you, realizing that my entire definition of home was sitting right next to me in a pair of sweatpants. I've been in love with you since that exact night, Sadie. I've just been too terrified of losing my best friend to ever find the courage to tell you the truth. A soft, choked sob fractured the quiet of the laundromat as Ben finished speaking. Sadie buried her face in her trembling hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she completely broke down into a fit of silent, agonizing tears. The sight of her weeping sent a violent wave of panic through Ben's chest, a sudden, terrifying fear that he had pushed too far, that he had broken the unspoken rule and ruined the only relationship that mattered to him. He stepped back slightly, his hands raised in a desperate, apologetic gesture. Sadie, I'm sorry, Ben stammered, his voice losing its steady authority, turning soft and raw with worry. I didn't mean to make you cry. If I ruined things, if I made you uncomfortable, just tell me and I will bury this forever. I swear You are such an idiot, Ben, Sadie interrupted, her voice a wet, angry sob as she suddenly snapped her head up, pulling her hands away from her face. She stepped forward, closing the small distance he had created, her eyes blazing through her tears with an emotional intensity that completely caught him off guard. She reached out, her hands grabbing the fabric of his jacket with a desperate, crushing grip that pinned him to the spot. I'm not crying because I'm uncomfortable, Sadie cried, her voice echoing off the metallic surfaces of the washing machines. I'm crying because I have been sitting on that exact same kitchen floor for an entire year, waiting for you to say those exact words to me. I have been in love with you since that birthday party too, Ben. When we were eating that ruined cake, you looked at me with this soft, beautiful look in your eyes, and my heart completely flipped over in my chest. I spent the last 12 months watching you go on dates with those other girls, sitting in my apartment in absolute agony, forcing myself to smile and give you dating advice because I was so profoundly terrified that if I spoke up, if I confessed my feelings, you wouldn't feel the same way. I thought that if I pushed you for more, I would lose the only anchor, the only real home I have left in this world. I have been suffering in the dark, Ben, trying to pretend that my favorite person was just an intense friendship. The final, invisible boundaries of their 6-year platonic camouflage completely dissolved into the warm, scented air of the empty laundromat. The absolute truth was out, the silence was dead, and the elaborate lie they had constructed to protect themselves had been entirely dismantled by the poetic reality of their mutual devotion. Ben stared down at her pale, tear-stained face, looking at the fierce grip of her fingers on his jacket, and felt an overwhelming, beautiful wave of peace completely erase the anxieties of his 20s. He didn't say another word. He reached out, his large, steady hands rising to cradle her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the hot tears on her pink cheeks with a reverence that felt like a silent vow. He leaned down slowly, his eyes locking onto hers, giving her a final, unhurried second to pull away if she needed to. But Sadie didn't pull away. She let out a soft, breathless sigh against his lips, her eyes closing as she tilted her chin up to meet him. Between the rows of rumbles from the industrial dryers, under the harsh, clinical glare of the 24-hour fluorescent lights, Ben and Sadie finally crossed the border and kissed. It wasn't a tentative, hesitant brush of lips, and it wasn't a dramatic, fast-paced cinematic performance. It was a beautifully soft, slow-burning, and deeply inevitable release of 6 years of hidden love. It was a kiss that tasted of absolute comfort, a physical manifestation of a home-like love that had survived the dark, survived the silence, and finally found its way into the light. Sadie's arms slid up his chest, wrapping tightly around his neck, her fingers locking into his hair as she pulled him closer, anchoring her entire existence to his frame. Ben held her secure against his chest, his arms wrapping around her waist, completely isolating the two of them from the cold city outside. The sterile laundromat, the flooded kitchen, the pile of unfolded sheets, it all faded into total insignificance. The only reality that mattered was the steady, burning warmth of their bodies melting together, the long-overdue transformation of their friendship into a permanent, unbreakable covenant. The poetic alignment of the universe has a wonderful way of settling into place once you stop fighting the current. A week later, the autumn afternoon sunlight was streaming through the clean, dry windows of Sadie's newly repaired kitchen, illuminating a space that felt completely transformed. The ancient washing machine had been replaced, the linoleum floor was dry, and a fresh pot of coffee was bubbling quietly on the counter, filling the apartment with a rich, comforting aroma. On the surface, their outside life looked completely identical to how it had been for the last 6 years. They were still wearing their comfortable sweatpants, they were still ordering the same cheap takeout, and they were still laughing at the same ridiculous inside jokes that ruined their sleep schedules. But the disguise was entirely gone. As Ben sat at the kitchen table, reviewing a design blueprint on his laptop, Sadie walked into the room, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She didn't set his mug down with a casual, distant platonic flick of her wrist. Instead, she slid naturally onto his lap, her movements fluid, unhurried, and entirely automated. Ben didn't flinch or look surprised. He simply closed his laptop with one hand, his other arm instinctively wrapping around her waist, pulling her close against his chest as she rested her forehead against his neck. They no longer had to hide their closeness, no longer had to wave off the suspicious questions from their families, and no longer had to pretend that their favorite person was just a childhood habit. They had stopped trying to survive in the shadows of an intense friendship and had finally stepped hand in hand into the warm, easy ground of a love that felt exactly like breathing. If this story brought a sense of comfort to your evening and made you look at your own relationships a little differently, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments section below. Have you ever had a friendship that felt like a quiet, hidden home just waiting for the right moment to open its doors? Or have you ever had to find the courage to say a truth that changed your entire destination? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another deeply satisfying relationship drama. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the easiest, most beautiful connections are the ones we spend the most time trying to hide.